24 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I need to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those online, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For interpretation online, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. I ask all participants to be careful when handling the earpieces in order to prevent feedback, which can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injuries. Please speak only into the microphone your headset is plugged into, and place earbuds away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use your raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage to speak in order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. Any technical issues arise, please inform us immediately. We may need to suspend to ensure interpretation is properly restored and before resuming proceedings. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 6, 2024, the committee is continuing its study of free trade negotiations between Canada and Ecuador. We have with us today the Department of Employment and Social Development, Pierre Bouchard, Director, Bilateral and Regional Labor Affairs, and from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, His Excellency Stephen Potter, Ambassador of Canada to Ecuador, Doug Forsyth, Director General, Market Access, Dean Foster, Director, Trade Policy and Negotiations, Ruben East, Deputy Director, Investment Trade Policy. Before I open up the floor for comments and remarks, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Canada to Ecuador, does not have a proper headset, so he will not be able to participate today. Speaking particularly with Mr. Cannings, who would very much like to have the ambassador's participation. We wonder if it's possible, Ambassador, you could listen in on the discussion this afternoon. You would not be able to comment back. But if you would like to appear, for us to make arrangements for you to appear at another occasion when you would have the appropriate headset on, we could also make that arrangement. What would the wishes of the committee? Would we invite the ambassador to come back at another meeting when we have the appropriate headset on? Mr. Cannings is saying yes. Okay. Sure, we have one more meeting. Yes. Yeah, we do. Absolutely. All right, Ambassador, please stay on the line if you like to hear the comments and discussion this afternoon. And that means you'll be extra prepared when you come back to the next committee meeting. Great. Thank you very much. All right, welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks. Mr. Forsyth, nice to see you back at our committee again. You make the opening statement for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it is nice to be back and to see all the committee members as well. I'm pleased to be here today to address this committee and welcome your study on the proposed Canada-Ecuador Free Trade Agreement negotiations. Votre étude arrive à point nommé, car les experts commerciaux...
Your study is timely, as the government trade experts responsible for the various areas of the FTA are currently engaged in policy development work with a view to proposing chapters for the planned negotiations. Our team is also finalizing work on the high-level negotiating objectives, which should be presented to Parliament by the end of the month, so that you can provide your comments before negotiations begin. Let me now turn to the background to the possible launch of these negotiations.
$116 billion US, Ecuador's GDP represents roughly 3% of South America's gross domestic product. It is the only country on the Pacific coast of South America that Canada does not presently have a free trade agreement with, given that one or more such agreements are in force with Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Panama. Ecuador's current government, under President Daniel Noboa, is among the most favorable to trade liberalization in the region. It also supports inclusive trade provisions in areas such as trade and gender, trade and indigenous peoples, as well as provisions on labor and the environment. It is notable that Ecuador is like-minded with Canada on issues such as human rights, the war in Ukraine, and the centrality of the international rules-based order. It sees an FTA's contribution to expanded economic prosperity as a means to advance its domestic, social, and security policies. As you may be aware, Canada and Ecuador's trade officials undertook exploratory discussions through much of 2023 prior to taking a mutual decision to proceed towards the launch of negotiations. The exploratory discussions revealed a broad alignment in terms of approach and a strong willingness on both sides to show flexibility and advance negotiations quickly. In addition, both sides intend to carry out the negotiations in a largely virtual format with minimal need for physical travel so as to approach the negotiations in a cost and time-efficient manner. Canada's objective is to negotiate a high-standard, ambitious trade agreement with Ecuador. We will seek an agreement that provides Canadian firms with preferential access to the Ecuadorian market, as well as increased transparency and certainty for Canadian service providers and investors. We will seek an agreement that reflects Canada's latest approaches, including in areas such as digital trade, inclusive trade, responsible business conduct, environment, and labor. We will seek an agreement that ensures that the benefits are widely shared, including with traditionally underrepresented groups such as women, Indigenous peoples, and small, medium-sized enterprises. Nous savons que cet accord bénéficie déjà d'un soutien.
We know that there is already support for this agreement. As part of the consultation process, we received favorable comments from stakeholders in the agricultural and mining sectors, among others. We also heard from a number of provinces and territories, all of which supported the initiative as a means of creating greater economic opportunities for Canadians and forging closer trade relations with Ecuador. In addition, stakeholders have expressed concerns about certain provisions, such as investment. And we are still considering how best to respond to these comments through the policy work underway on our various FTA chapters and through initiatives that are outside the agreement.
And consider your recommendations once you have completed your study. In terms of economic impact, I will begin by noting that bilateral merchandise trade between Canada and Ecuador has been growing by 11% a year on average since 2010, reaching $1.3 billion in 2022. Nearly 40% of Canada's exports to Ecuador and nearly 90% of Canada's current imports from Ecuador are already duty-free. Preliminary analysis by the Chief Economist's Office here at Global Affairs Canada has estimated that an FTA between Canada and Ecuador would generate modest but positive economic benefits for both countries. Canadian export gains are predicted in a wide variety of areas, such as wheat, pulses, and manufactured goods, as well as in services trade. Overall, preliminary estimates suggest that under an ambitious trade agreement, Canada's GDP could increase by about $83 million by 2030, while Ecuador's GDP could increase by approximately $49.3 million over the same time frame. A particular area of interest as we head into negotiations relates to investment. As of 2022, Canada had the largest stock of foreign direct investment in Ecuador of any country at $2.6 billion, led by investments in the mining sector. Enforcement of investment chapter obligations through investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, is a key interest for Canadian industry stakeholders. In 2017, under a previous government, Ecuador notified its intentions to terminate its 1997 FIPA, or Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, with Canada. Termination became effective in 2018, although existing investments continued to be protected until 2033. However, we note that a recent ruling by Ecuador's Constitutional Court has found the inclusion of an ISDS mechanism in Ecuador's FTA with Costa Rica unconstitutional. Deliberations in Ecuador are ongoing regarding whether there are options that would allow it to move forward under certain conditions, and this process will remain ongoing early in the months of our FTA negotiations. Officials will explore options in this regard with Ecuador once negotiations begin, and we intend to base our position on Canada's latest investment agreement model, which includes clarifying that the parties maintain their right to regulate and preserve required policy flexibility in areas such as the environment, health, safety, Indigenous rights, gender equality, and cultural diversity. Dans l'ensemble et en conclusion, Affaires mondiales Canada.
Overall, and in conclusion, Global Affairs Canada and the other departments involved in our trade policy consider that a free trade agreement between Canada and Ecuador would be economically beneficial and provide a means of supporting a like-minded and like-valued government in the region.
Look forward to reviewing the results of your work once your study has been completed. Thank you, Madam
Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Forsyth. Mr. Baldinelli for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. My first question is, we had a previous hearing just the other day, and one of the witnesses from Cereals Canada mentioned that they sense the new Canada-Ecuador Free Trade Agreement will be focused on trying to reinforce the existing market share Canada has in Ecuador rather than focusing on growth. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
For the question, Madam Chair, I think the opportunities that exist under the FTA negotiations with Ecuador are through our economic model show that there are opportunities within the agriculture space for sure. I think within the we have noted that wheat is a key export interest of ours and a key area where I think we'll be able to benefit. And I would add pulses to that as well. So I think that there is an excellent opportunity to grow our exports in that marketplace. Pardon me. And then in addition, we have Ecuador has free trade agreements with a couple of a couple of our competitors, including European Union and China, and any of the tariff advantages that they have in that marketplace. I think we will be able to negotiate something similar so that we will be on equal footing with our competitors.
Thank you, Mr. Forsyth. I just want to go on. And like in December 2023, the minister tabled a notice of intent to negotiate. And following that, there were consultations that flowed from that, seeking input from stakeholder communities, provinces, and so on. And could you tell us, or can you table with us, like how many provinces and territories, non-governmental organizations, and individuals, how many took part?
As you note, we did send out a broad-based consultation request through the Canada Gazette for input on the FTA. So I think most provinces responded with their interest, either directly written or verbally. We have a consultation mechanism through a Canada CIIT group, we call it, where we regularly discuss FTAs, and where a number of provinces also indicated their interest. Key exporting associations, such as, again, mostly agriculture, but mining as well, also indicated their interest. And we did receive a number of letters and emails from NGOs as well. Yes.
Mr. Forsyth, as this is kind of like a pre-study by parliamentarians on an upcoming agreement that will be, with a notice to be tabled, is it possible? Are those documents public? Can they be shared with the committee for its own review as we're undertaking this study?
The inputs of others, you mean?
Yes, through your consultation.
They're not public, no. I think we do publish a summary from time to time.
Can we get a copy of that summary then?
We haven't put it together as of yet, but
when
I don't know if we will have it done in time for you to complete your study.
Oh, okay.
Depending on the timing.
Now, can you also then provide the committee with any documents related to your internal analysis on the expected benefits to Canadian trade and for exporters with Ecuador under any future free trade agreement?
I think we have a summary document that we could provide on that.
Thank you. There's multiple other trade discussions taking place, such as Canada and the Pacific Alliance, whom Ecuador is also a candidate to join. Can you comment on the Pacific Alliance negotiation, as it's been some time since we've heard about this? GAC states that 8 rounds of negotiations have taken place. Is that accurate? And what is the status?
That is my understanding. 8 rounds have taken place. There has not been one for, I would say, 2 years, probably, at least. It's not my file, so I'm not totally up to speed on it. However, I would say that there are a couple of outstanding issues that are beyond the control of Canada that are preventing the negotiations from moving along.
Now, starting the pre-negotiations with Ecuador, how does that impact our other trade negotiations? Can you list the complete free trade discussions, negotiations that are currently happening that are also taking the time of GAC? So what happens? Are there pauses on other trade negotiations that you're working on so that you can concentrate on one particular?
So we have an excellent team of negotiators at Global Affairs Canada, if I do say so myself, and we are actively engaged on a number of files, as you note. So chief amongst them, active negotiations with ASEAN, the Asian Economic Association group, with Indonesia. I have appeared here as the chief negotiator for Canada-UK. Those negotiations are paused for the moment at the request of the UK. We have, those are the major ones. I think
Thank you, Mr. Forsyth.
Baldinelli, Mr. Aria, please, for 6 minutes.
Chair. Mr. Forsyth, welcome back to the committee. In the previous meeting, one of our colleagues remarked that the trade between Canada and Ecuador is so modest, why do we need it? So that was the sort of thought. But we need trade agreements with big markets, small markets, all markets. I think we have 15 agreements covering 51 countries. The more we have, the better. Every small thing helps. And again, in my view, the process of negotiation, many a times, maybe the Canada-UK trade negotiation have been paused. So is with Canada-India, it has been paused. But the process sometimes brings in benefit. Very specifically, 2 days back I learned one of the demands of Canada in India for the tax exemption for the pension fund investments. I'm told of the $75 billion Canada has invested in India, bulk of it is from our pension plans. I was told that in the last budget in India early this month, they have given exemptions to pension funds from the income tax provisions. And the only pension funds investing in India are from Canada. So that is the direct benefit. So in my view, it is important that whatever the market we have, Ecuador or any small market or big market, I think we should continue to do on. A couple of questions, if we can combine that and address. One is that in the last meeting, again, some people came that, oh, why we shouldn't have ISDS. My view is that ISDS provisions, we as Canada, we should look from the interest of Canada, our economy, our corporations, our businesses. Just elaborate slightly on the importance of ISDS. It can vary from market to market. It may not be relevant to every single market we negotiate with, but why that is important in general. And even here you mentioned the expected benefits is moderate. Though it is the benefits is moderate, but how important it is in the bigger picture of Canada having free trade agreement with different countries in different parts of the world. If you can kindly talk on those things.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. And I think I'll give the broader answer your broader question and turn to my colleague on ISDS. But I think from a Canadian government perspective, I think to your point, to the point made with respect to broadening and deepening our trading relationship with as many countries as possible. Part of the government's trade diversification strategy, and so whether that's looking to negotiate with larger countries like Indonesia, groups like Indonesia, or pause negotiations like India and the UK. I think that's all part and parcel of that program. Of course, we do most of our trades with the United States, and it is certainly in Canada's best interest to broaden that as much as possible, to the extent possible. I think it gives it not only, especially for the smaller countries, though, in the region, it also gives them, it also helps integrate them with other countries, in other supply chains, and I think it provides us with with Canadian companies and exporters with new markets, but also with sources of supply. So totally agree with the statement. And maybe I'll.
Yes, before Mr. East can come on ISDS, just want you to reconfirm that. Anyway, I lost my. Let Mr. East answer, then I'll come back to you. I just wanted to make sure that you agree. If we don't negotiate with thinking that the market is small, our competitors will come in, and Canada may lose its advantage. For example, in Ecuador, we have potential to export wheat, and if we are not there, if other countries who have got advantage in wheat production and export, they have free trade agreement, we will lose our advantage.
100% correct. I think that's exactly it. And I think we're not only trying to, we're trying to open up markets for exporters, but at the same time, we're competing against other countries who are also doing the same for their exporters. So exactly right.
Yes, thank you for the question. So in terms of why we like to include investor-state dispute settlement in our model, I guess I'll cite a few reasons. This is not an exhaustive list, but a few of them. The first is that it's proven to be an investment chapter with an investor-state dispute settlement provisions has proven to be an investment attraction vehicle because it gives, it provides the combination of these things, provides a stable, predictable environment for Canadian investors when they invest abroad. So it's we've heard from stakeholders it's quite important to carry on to do that, and so that's one reason why. Another reason is that if we were to have a set of obligations in an investment chapter, which is the way we approach things, we feel it's also important to have a means to enforce those obligations. An investor-state dispute settlement is a means to do that. So it's quite important to have the two. And again, our stakeholders have said quite clearly to us that if we're going to have a set of obligations, that it's important to have a means to enforce those obligations. And a third reason is that the set of obligations that you would find in an investment chapter, these international obligations, usually the only means to actually enforce them is through the treaty-based mechanism. So for example, I'll just take an example in an existing agreement, the CIIT, our agreement with the European Union. Were in the future a Canadian investor attempt to invoke the obligations under that treaty before a court in one of the European Union countries, it couldn't do that because the treaty itself states that that's the mechanism to use, and those domestic courts don't have the legal competence to hear those claims. So, but for that mechanism, there'd be no means to actually enforce those obligations. So those are a few reasons.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Salutations à nos témoins.
I welcome our guests. You spoke briefly about the sectors which could benefit. What are the sectors which, according to them, should... Why Ecuador? What is the point?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. And so yes.
Merci pour la question. Oui, tout à fait. Il y a toujours de l'intérêt de deux parties, l'agriculture et de notre point de vue pour l'Équateur, ils produisent une minute, nous n'avons pas de traduction. Il y a quelque chose qui cloche dans cette salle. Arrêtez-vous une seconde, s'il vous plaît. Dites quelque chose en...
Okay, I think we're back on. Okay, please continue.
Would you like me to start again? Est-ce que tu veux que je recommence? Oui, okay. Okay. So yes, in any free trade agreement negotiations, each side has interest. In this case, we both have agriculture interests, and as the member noted, our key agriculture interests are on wheat and lentils, I would add, and oats. From Ecuador's interest, they are a large producer of cut flowers, many different kinds of cut flowers, roses, carnations, etc. Our MFN tariff on that is, depending on the type of flowers, about 10%. So we do have FTAs with some other cut flower producers in South America, for example, Colombia. The Colombian flowers come in duty free if they're grown in the country, and Ecuador flowers right now would pay a tariff. So that's their key interest.
Dites-moi, existe-t-il dans plusieurs secteurs, évidemment, il y a des produits que nous ne produisons pas ici, il y en a d'autres qu'on va produire et que ces accords vont sans doute...
There are products which could competition. So people should know here what products are coming.
Is there a problem?
C'est Madame Fortier qui va nous faire l'interprétation.
Okay, keep going, please.
So during the consultations, we heard from most export interests. We didn't hear from any Canadian companies that had an interest in import interest, if I understood your question correctly. Si j'ai bien compris la question, c'est plus les liens entre les...
So if I understood you correctly, in fact, my question is for several of these products. We have an agriculture here, and the conditions will not be the same. So it's competition for a local product. And was anybody consulted for it?
Everyone, both with an export interest and an import interest, of course, were consulted. Did not hear anyone concerned about the competition from any producers or exporters in Ecuador.
Pourriez-vous d'ailleurs nous informer au niveau de la transparence sur ce qui a été fait? Quelle a été la nature de la consultation? Combien de jours?
How transparent was this consultation? How long did they take?
One that we usually use, as I mentioned earlier, or as was mentioned earlier, Minister made the announcement of notice of intent in Parliament, and then we launched the consultation process. I think it was on for a month, 30 days through the Canada Gazette process. So I think 30 days of outreach. And we received, as I mentioned previously, we received a number of emails, letters from interested parties, and as I said, we continue to be open to hear from other parties if they were missed during the consultative process. They can get in touch with Global Affairs through our general email address.
Dites-moi combien de points de vue vous avez reçus dans le cadre de votre consultation?
How many points of view did you? How many positions did you hear? Indications of interest.
Do you have the exact number? I don't have the exact number in front of me.
So we received around 30 submissions in total, but some of those would be aggregated industry associations that would have many members. Some of them would be individuals. Some would be provinces and territories who consulted their own stakeholders within their own jurisdictional areas. So it's a bit difficult to say exactly how many stakeholders were reached, but more or less 30 submissions, which is what we would normally expect for a negotiation of this scale.
Dites-moi maintenant, on sait combien de temps, Madame la Présidente, combien de temps j'ai? Une minute. Regardez, on sait que...
How much time do I have? 1 minute. Okay, we know that there's a safety flagrant, brutal crisis. Canada, does it have a strategy about human rights there?
It's unfortunate that the ambassador isn't able to answer this question, so I would maybe, maybe he can elaborate next time when he is online, but I would say from an economic point of view and from a negotiating point of view, we're cognizant of what is happening in Ecuador. We're in touch with and in close communication with our embassy to see how things are moving. And again, we're in touch. We have close contact with our counterparts in the embassy at the government of Ecuador as well. So all of these pieces we take into account as we're looking to move forward and to ensure that there is an economic benefit for Canada as we commence the negotiations and continue on with those negotiations. So those are pieces of the puzzle. Absolutely.
Okay. 20 seconds left.
Je vais me reprendre au prochain tour.
Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here again. It's good to see you once again. I think I was going to ask that previous question that Mr. Savard-Tremblay asked, but I'm going to jump in to a discussion of ISDS. And, after the completion of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement in 2018, sorry, I've lost my screen here. Okay. Minister Freeland, who was then Minister of International Trade, among other things, said she was very proud of the fact that we didn't include ISDS in CUSMA. Said ISDS elevates, this is a quote from her, ISDS elevates the rights of corporations over those of sovereign governments. In removing it, we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest, to protect public health and the environment. And we've had a number of cases in Canada that have been very expensive to Canadians, and we've had a number of cases in foreign countries, in the guise of protecting Canadian investments. And as was mentioned, Ecuador, in the face of one of those, actually pulled out of its agreements because it didn't like what it was seeing, the effect that foreign governments could have on environmental and human rights legislation and work in Ecuador. And now we have a different government. I'm just wondering why Canada has seemingly changed its mind on ISDS. The world seems to be going away from it, Europe, but we seem to be doubling down on it, especially in cases where we have the Canadian mining industry and some players in that. Well, I'll just leave it at that. I won't go into any details, but why are we so keen on it still in this day when there seems to be a movement away from it elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll come back a little bit to some of the reasons I stated earlier in terms of why we use the investor state dispute settlement. Just in the case, but to bring it back to Ecuador first and foremost, as you mentioned, and was mentioned at the outset, we did have a foreign investment protection agreement that was terminated in 2018. So the current status is that if an investment was made, I think more or less before May 2018, those investments are protected up until 2033. There's a clause in that foreign investment protection agreement, which is quite common, and that's how that works. So in other words, if a Canadian investor were to make an investment pursuant to a future free trade agreement with Ecuador that includes investment chapter, including ISDS, until that happens, they would not have that type of protection. nor would they have the ability to use ISDS. So there's an important element to that.
Can I just
Of
jump in?
course.
And, you know, we hear that the new ISDS, ISDS 2.0 has, protections in it that say this doesn't prevent either of the parties from legislating protections for human rights or the environment. We have a situation in Ecuador, the Loma Larga mega mining project owned by Dundee Precious Metals, almost 8,000 hectares of paramo. We've had 2 binding referendums of Ecuadorian citizens that have come out with more than 80% in favor of stopping these mining projects because they're affecting the water supply for Cuenca, 600,000 people. And yet the Ecuadorian government and the company insist on advancing the project in violation of the rights to political participation. I guess I'm skeptical that this new, if a new Ecuadorian government came in and said, sorry, Dundee, you can't go ahead. We've had these referenda and we are, pulling the rights to mine here. Would that protect the Ecuadorian people, or would those go ahead? Because it seems that other situations have arisen where this doesn't really protect those governments from legislating about human rights or the environment.
Thank you for the question. So I think a few points. One is, in this situation that we're in, we've heard from Ecuador that they're interested in discussing an investment chapter with us. In our discussions, we've sent a model to them that includes investor-state dispute settlement. They're very aware of that. At the outset, you will have heard that Canada, if I'm not mistaken, is Ecuador's #1 investor. So there's mutual interest there in terms of an investment chapter with investment protection. But we have a different model, a very different model from what existed in the 1997 FIPA. We created a new model, a foreign investment protection agreement that came in that was made publicly available, I think, in 2021. It's a very different model. It builds on more than 30 years of our experience, both in receiving claims, for example, under the NAFTA, and also further investment agreements and investment chapters with partners like the European Union. So it's a chapter that has, I think, the right balance of the right to regulate on one hand and to protect things like human rights, environment, et cetera, and the ability to protect those things, while at the same time providing for investors.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martel, please, for 5 minutes.
5 minutes, hein?
5 minutes. Might stretch it a little bit.
Oui, OK. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci d'être avec nous cet après-midi. Je ne sais pas qui peut me répondre, mais je voudrais savoir, selon vous, là, c'est quoi les avantages d'entamer des négociations d'échange commercial avec l'Équateur, tandis que le Canada est déjà en négociation avec le Royaume-Uni, l'Indonésie, la NAS et l'Inde? Comment cet accord-là peut se distinguer des autres? Il y en a plus que les autres?
Wrong channel. Okay, can we try that again? Okay, we're gonna, just a second, we're gonna start again, Mr. Martel.
Moi, j'aimerais ça savoir.
Reprendre. I would like to know what are the advantages of having negotiations and how this agreement be distinguished from the others. If I understood your question,
From an overall trade negotiations perspective, I think
d'une perspective de
we definitely have a good base of knowledge from which we work. We have our negotiators get experience through the various negotiations, whether that's the UK, whether that's India, whether that is Indonesia and ASEAN, and that helps us build our positions as we move forward. What we'd like to do during the negotiations is to, if we get an outcome, a negotiated outcome in one agreement that is favorable to Canada, whether it's in, doesn't matter what the issue area is, but then we like to build on that and build on that experience and use it in to the greatest extent possible with the next negotiating partner. So I think in this one, some of the areas that we have negotiated with, not so much with the UK, but maybe with some of the smaller partners, I think will benefit our negotiating experience, and we look to make some of those similar type arrangements in the Canada-Ecuador FTA negotiations.
Merci. Vous avez dit que ça serait
Thank you. You said it would be economically advantageous, that agreement. Could you tell me in what way, what will be the economic impact overall to be expected from a free trade agreement with Ecuador? Thank you for the question. As I mentioned during my
opening statement, I think that there will be some economic benefits in the FTA. They're small. There's no question that Ecuador-Canada trade right now, it's not huge, but at the same time, it will generate, or our chief economist office estimates that there will be positive economic benefits in the amount of, as I said, GDP could increase by about $83 million for Canada by 2030, and Ecuador could increase by about almost $50 million over the same time frame. So not huge, but when you think about how much trade is happening this year, $1.3 billion bilateral trade, but growing, right? I mean, the objective here is really about trade diversification and finding new partners. And I think, like I said, Ecuador does provide that for Canadian producers and exporters.
With a tense political climate in Ecuador, do you think that could cause a problem?
Again, thank you for the question. I think it would be helpful to hear from our ambassador on that particular point. But what we have noted during the preliminary discussions with Ecuador is a very willing government, a very willing partner to engage in the negotiations, to engage in the negotiations that we would look at, whether that's on the goods side, services, investment, environment, financial services, all of the areas that we traditionally would put in an FTA. I think that is what we're seeing from Ecuador, and that's from both levels of government. They recently had an election, and that even with the new government in place, there is an openness on the economic front to move forward with the agenda, and I think that their economic agenda matches well with Canada's on that front. So, and I would probably at this point I would turn to the ambassador, but because he's not available, I would save that for next time.
Okay, you have 15 seconds remaining. Okay, thank you. Mr. Sheehan, please.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. And you'd mentioned that Ecuador was one of the only countries that we didn't have a free trade agreement on a Pacific South Coast. So I would imagine it would be Panama, Peru, Chile, Ecuador. Any others?
Mexico. Colombia and Mexico.
Yeah. And Mexico.
Yeah.
So what are the advantages then? Like you said that the unilateral trade deal between Canada in Ecuador would bring modest increases, but what about the multiplier effect of then, a company from Canada or whatever being able to, look at that whole area? Maybe you can make some comments about that.
Thank you very much for the question. No, certainly that's an excellent point, and I would especially look at sort of our western provinces as well in that regard, just based on kind of location, transportation costs, et cetera. But it is, we have had FTAs. I would also add Chile in there as well, but not a little bit farther south. But just the ability to, or the recognition that South America itself is a large market, untapped, frankly, from a broader Canadian perspective, and a number of countries that we haven't necessarily focused on, but do provide tremendous advantages to Canadian companies and exporters. And I think a lot of opportunity, untapped opportunities, I would say, to your point. And so I think, this is another foot into the marketplace. I think it's, again, it's a small foot for the time being, but it can lead somewhere else. And I think that's important as well as we look to negotiate the FTA, is that it's not just about today and kind of where we are at in terms of our trade, but what about tomorrow, next year, in 5-10 years? That's also important. So,
you mentioned about the new president. In the past they were considered protectionists, just what you read. But you mentioned about the opportunities of creating a progressive agenda. And in your remarks, you mentioned that not only monetary, but through gender, indigenous, environment. How does that work, and where do you see the opportunities?
So we traditionally, when you talk about free trade agreements, it's a lot about trade in goods, trade in services, and over the last number of years, decades, we have expanded that trade environment. Trade in gender, trade in SMEs, trade in indigenous peoples, and so these are the trade and issues that we often talk about. I think it provides an opportunity for Canada writ large to promote, export the way we do things, the way we deal with all of those issues outside the sort of the traditional trade agreement areas. And I think it is important to recognize that and to look to try and export that as well. I think I said that Ecuador is a country that has indicated an openness to these other areas. They are participant in a number of environment issues beyond trade. Whether that's whether that is at the UN or elsewhere. But it's important to bring some of those areas into trade, to the trade agreements, to the greatest extent possible. And when you have a willing partner, I think it makes it much easier and much more beneficial for the two parties. So.
Thank you very much. And how much time? 1 minute? Okay. So the whole trade with Ecuador, there seems to be a lot of opportunities, and some of the things that you were talking about, I had asked the earlier panel about some of the recent agreements that they had signed around gender and around being more open with trade. So, different elements are written right into the agreement, thereby defining how we can do this, or is it, you know what I mean? It's in black and white, right? And then how do you enforce things like that as it goes on?
Very much depends on, thank you for the question, it very much depends on the chapter and what is being negotiated. So I think in many of those chapters, not all, but many of them, they're cooperation based, not necessarily, not subject to dispute settlement. So it's very much the case that both countries are like-minded on certain issues. And so provides you with the opportunity, the framework, if you will, to have those discussions and to have those to set up to make sure that both countries have the right people in place, the right people around the table after the agreement is negotiated, to be able to have further engagement on whichever topic is at issue. And so I think that's helpful. Again, a lot of those areas are not necessarily subject to dispute settlement, so to your point about, is there a way to hold their feet to the fire? I think the way to do that is through engagement. And I think that's what we have found over the years as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci. Je voudrais revenir sur la question.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to the issue of dispute settlement between investors and the state. Can you inform the committee on the total number of suits, prosecutions that Canada has had, and the number of cases where we were successful in those prosecutions?
Yes, thank you for the question. In terms of the amount of cases brought against Canada, 35 cases in total, almost all of those under the NAFTA, one under foreign investment protection we have with Egypt. Under those cases, Canada won 13 of those. 5 of those cases we did not win. 5 of those cases were settled. 6 of them are ongoing, and 7 are either inactive, terminated, or withdrawn. That now, I've double counted one particular case, and that's the Bilcon case, because there was a finding, but it is still ongoing. There's a damages part to settle. So that's the total number.
Et combien de cas parmi ceux-ci ont été des
And how
règlements?
many of those cases were settled out of court and resulted in a withdrawal from measures in place or political will or whatever?
If I understood the question correctly, in terms of cases, I'll just come back again to the numbers first and then second part of the question. But as I said, 5 cases were settled, and 7 of them were either inactive, terminated, or withdrawn. When they're withdrawn, those are, I can tell you because in a couple of those cases, I was trade counsel historically. Those were cases that in a consultation setting, for example, 2 of them I can think of were withdrawn by the investor. They were hoping they could, at that point, get some type of settlement. We said, no, we'll be defending that vigorously. They decided to withdraw that case to avoid costs against them, for example. But I think you had part of your question had to do with measures and some measures being withdrawn. Is that correct? In my understanding, in no case was a measure withdrawn, because under investor state, there's only one thing that a tribunal can do if there is a case where they have found a breach, and that is to award damages. They cannot order a country in our cases treaties with Canada to withdraw a measure.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to, at the start, Mr. Forsyth, you mentioned there'll be chapters or language on Indigenous peoples, on human rights, on the environment. And yet there will also be an investor chapter with ISDS mechanisms. And here we have a case in Ecuador. It seems to me that one of the main conflicts around human rights and the environment, Indigenous peoples in Ecuador, happen, unfortunately, because of Canadian investors. And the ISDS is being used to protect them from efforts from an Ecuadorian government to legislate to protect its own peoples and its own environment. I'm just wondering why are we doing this? How are we helping the Ecuadorian people by combining those two things? And there's this right to regulate language, but in Colombia, we have an agreement that language proved useless. And when the Colombian government tried to regulate around the Canadian mining firm Eco Oro, it used that ISDS provision, and the Colombian government lost when they felt that this mining company was damaging the environment. I'm really struggling here how this helps Canada or how it helps Ecuador, how we can regulate UNDRIP in this situation when we have a clear case of an Ecuadorian government and a Canadian company that is flaunting the whole free, prior, and informed consent aspect of UNDRIP. It just, I don't know, I am lost. I can't see why we're even thinking of undertaking these negotiations if that's our baseline.
Thank you for the question. So I think in our current model and the model that we've proposed to work with Ecuador on, it's careful to balance, as I mentioned earlier, the rights of investors through obligations, protections, and a mechanism to do that, but with the right to regulate the protection in areas such as the environment, labor, human rights, etc. And we think that this model that we have now, much, much different than a 1997 model, strikes that balance. And I'll give you a few examples. We've talked a few times about right to regulate provisions. Those were not in our old model. They are currently, as of CITA going forward, they are in all our FTAs across the board, not just on investment. Another thing we've done is to strengthen, I talked about the balance. We've strengthened substantive provisions, for example, in the investment chapter, like expropriation. So, for example, the mere effect on an investor's investment does not amount to an expropriation. This is something that we've clarified in our provisions that wasn't there in the past. And third, both parties in a treaty can take reservations to protect their public policy space in areas that they feel need protection. And we do that as a matter in regularly, and so do our partners. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. That was a very lengthy question that would probably take the entire panel, but you had an extra minute there, but you do get 2.5 minutes if we get to another round, so maybe they can finish the answer then, so my apologies. Mr. McGuire, please, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation today. I just wanted to just start off with a couple of simple questions that I had about the export products in wheat. You mentioned wheat and pulse crops, particularly lentils, being priority. Have we any idea of the volumes that we're trading in that area in either of those products right now?
So our dollar value, I thank you, Madam Chair. I give you dollar value of our imports, but if that's okay. So in fact, wheat is our top duty bill export into Ecuador's market, and we sent an average over the time period from 2019 to 2022. We sent about $261 million worth of exports. So.
Sure, totally.
Average from 2019 to 2022, so per year, U.S. dollars. So,
any in the mineral side, is potash involved in that as well?
I don't see potash as a top 10 export, but nevertheless, I'm not sure what their MFN duty rate is on that potash. I'm not. I could check for you.
I noted that Saskatchewan and Alberta are our major export areas in the agriculture side with the most potential there. Just on it caught my eye on the oil developments there as well. Excuse me. We're exporting, what is it, 178 million dollars worth of crude oil to them, one of our major exports of the 679 that you had in the trade. And we send them we send refined oil back. Is that correct?
I'm not entirely certain about the oil trade in terms of what goes and what comes back, but look into it.
How do the Ecuadorian oil environmental standards for petroleum products in Ecuador compare to those here in Canada?
Thank you for the question. Compared to in Canada, I honestly, I don't know enough about it. I'd have to look into it. And as I'm thinking, that might be a question we could pose to the ambassador when he comes back, and we could just close the loop with him in terms of providing a more fulsome answer in terms of what the regulations are in Ecuador on that.
I asked that similar because it's a similar question to what my colleague from the NDP just asked in relation to labor intensity and that sort of thing, and the agreement of the, if I get my terms right here, the GTAGA, the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement with the Inclusive Trade Action Group, and how we're involved with that. If we're making sure that there are rules in place for one, are they also in place for the environmental side? Can someone answer that for me?
Sure, I'll take that one. We intend fully to pursue robust provisions in labor and environment and to back those by dispute settlement as per our usual approach in free trade agreement negotiations.
Just wanted to wonder if there are industries in Canada that you're aware of that would benefit from this free trade agreement due to the current lack of markets here. Are there opportunities there for products that we aren't processing or developing here? Or actually for the products that we are processing here? New ones, I mean, other than because I know, Mr. Forsyth, you mentioned that this is an agreement that we can really expand on if there's opportunities there, and I just wondered if you could elaborate on that.
I guess I can keep going with that. So in addition to products mentioned already, agricultural products like wheat and lentils, largely out of Western provinces going out of the Port of Vancouver, we have manufacturing goods interests in Quebec and Ontario, especially with a booming air cargo business out of Toronto Pearson. So that's largely the basis of interest from Quebec and Ontario, for example.
Types of power developments we have in Canada, is there any opportunity for that in this country, in Ecuador? I mean, we've been in South America for years in power development opportunities. I just wondered how that affects Ecuador here.
Well, I would say that really any services, investment, or trade in goods opportunities would be opened up by this agreement. As was mentioned, this is a last kind of puzzle piece in the Pacific coast of South America that we don't have FTA coverage with. They do not have an FTA with the United States. That gives a competitive advantage scenario. So really, when you look at long-term commercial development, we have a study recently done on our Canada-Chile FTA after 25 years, and we found 400% growth of trade. I would think about the Ecuador FTA as a sort of piece of that broader puzzle with our exporters, services providers who are experienced in the Andean region, that this is another opportunity in that broader portfolio story.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. I'm sorry I let you go. I know I gave you some extra time as it was. Ms. Fortier, please, 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Alors, merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today for this important panel. Our government is committed to reconciliation, as we know, and that includes economic reconciliation. And we talk a lot about the way that trade agreements can benefit Canadian companies. But could you talk, and you mentioned this a little bit, but could you talk to us concretely about the efforts and actions being made and or should be made as part of the negotiations with the Ecuadorian government to promote and facilitate access to Indigenous companies to that market, and also Indigenous companies in Ecuador? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. And I think absolutely that is a key priority for the government and for us in our FTA negotiations. What we have seen, starting from a broad base, certainly Aboriginal companies, Indigenous-based companies have the similar opportunities that other Canadian companies have, but at the same time, because they're generally smaller, generally don't look to export, we try to give them a boost, if you will, to do what we can. So we do that not only within the FTA, but certainly outside of the FTA as well through our Trade Commissioner Service at Global Affairs Canada. So We work very closely with our colleagues to ensure that those opportunities are there for Aboriginal businesses. Aboriginal businesses. I would also add, though, that what we have done within an FTA is to build on, with each FTA, each recent FTA, Indigenous chapters, trade and Indigenous chapters, and to build on language in each chapter, make sure that we are covering more and more bases. And so what that is exactly what we're doing. We were doing that with we did that with the Canada-Ukrainian FTA. We were working on it under the Canada-UK and just building on all of the, continuing to build on the pieces, the chapter pieces for Canada Indigenous FTA pieces in the trade agreement. So it's certainly something that we continue to focus on and do what we can both within the FTA and outside of it. So.
J'ai pas beaucoup de temps, donc je vais aller au prochain
I
thème.
don't have a lot of time left, so I'll go to the next theme. So Ecuador joined the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, and it also joined the ITAG in 2023, and Canada so it was the goal is to promote the equality of gender equality and women's economic empowerment, and the other question, the inclusivity as well. So I would like to know what are the implications of Canada's participation in this, in the GTA, GA, and ITAG with respect to the presence of, if we were to establish an agreement, what role would those play in that?
Well, I would see, thank you for the question, first of all. We would see those as complementary initiatives. For example, in fact, all of the other members of the GTAGA and ITAG are partners with whom we already have free trade agreements with. We're able to have more plurilateral discussions, build further synergies with those partners. And then in the FTA, we focus on our chapters on trade and gender, trade and Indigenous peoples, and build cooperation activities bilaterally, one-on-one, during and after the entry into force of the agreement.
Mais avez-vous des mesures spécifiques pour vraiment
Do you have specific measures to encourage women-run businesses that are new in the export industry? Because we're working more and more to give those opportunities. So do you have any concrete examples that you could, of how this could be done as part of this FTA?
Well, certainly. The intent of the chapter is to promote women-owned business trade and, for example, women-led business trade missions. All those types of promotional activities are within the scope of what we have in mind. And these are areas that our Ecuadorian colleagues are very excited to explore with us and are committed to pursuing through the trade agreement.
Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Quickly, I just want to follow up. Based on the excellent briefing materials that were provided by our staff, I mean, they broke out some interesting statistics based on StatsCan data. And, from 2022, and, Canadian exports are to Ecuador were 603 million, wheat almost 300 million of that, refined oil, secondly, $164 million. So those two items were about 77% of our trade exports. And then Ecuador exports to Canada 79 million, and crude oil is number one at $178 million. Precious minerals, ores, $150 million. Again, those two make up about 48% of the total exports to Canada. So those two items are quite important to Ecuador, I would imagine, in any trade agreement that they reach with Canada. So have they positioned any policies or positions to Canada with regards to protecting crude oil exports to Canada?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair, and just a couple of pieces on that. So thank you for that information. So we're just at a preliminary discussion with Ecuador. We haven't delved into where our interests lie with specific products. As we study their economy and study what their dutiable exports are, That's, I think, from our assessment where their interests might be, but they haven't expressed those interests to us directly. And so I think just to clarify, though, I think the MFN tariff rate on some of the products you mentioned coming into Canada may be zero. So, and similar, our exports to the Ecuador.
Does not concern the government that as an oil-producing nation, that Ecuadorian oil is being imported into Canada instead of us being allowed to service our own market?
Thank you for the question. I guess it depends on the kind of oil that's coming in, what it's used for, and again, if it's coming in at no duty, then it would come in from if the MFN duty rate on that is zero. It could come from anywhere, whether it's Ecuador or United States or.
How are the Ecuadorian oil environmental standards compared to the most ethically produced oil and natural gas in the world?
That's an excellent question, and I think one that perhaps our ambassador would be best placed to answer when he's online.
Okay, thank you. And there were riots in the streets in Ecuador previously when the government moved to reduce gasoline subsidies and increase prices. So could you confirm that Canada is not going to introduce or insist on a carbon tax in this free trade agreement?
I think as part of our discussions with Ecuador, we are looking at a comprehensive environment chapter. Whether Ecuador is interested in discussions about that, I'm not aware. But given the fact that that we are in preliminary discussions with them about launching an FTA, I'm not sure anything is off the table, frankly.
Madam Chair, how much time?
14 seconds.
I understand from the Trade Commissioner Services, they mentioned Ecuador seeking to attract investment in project areas such as transportation, electricity, water, construction, telecommunications, education, and so on. Right now, primarily our investments are, the largest investments are in the natural resource sector. Is it possible to define for us, like the other natures of investments, how significant they are in Ecuador?
I think certainly mining is number one, as you note. The others, I'm
not aware of anything reaching the scale of our mining investment.
There are those opportunities, like my colleague had
opportunities,
mentioned, electricity
certainly.
generation and so on.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Arya, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are some well-intentioned NGOs in Canada who advocate on behalf of the people of Ecuador. Not all people, obviously the government and the majority of the people of Ecuador welcome foreign trade agreements. Just to give a parallel example, a couple of hundred people in Quebec, led by Greenpeace, protested against the Northvolt $7 billion investment in Quebec, employing 3,000 people to manufacture batteries. Based on that, if the people in Sweden advocate to their government that the people of Canada are protesting, so let's not have trade or investment in Canada. So we have to understand that the global south is changing. I know we mentioned about the human rights, gender equality issues, and other social issues. I hope that we know that we can't, Canada as a developed country, we can't be seen to be lecturing or preaching. I think we have to use our words carefully. And we have to be more prudent and pragmatic. However, the well-intentioned arguments against Canadian business, against Canadian interest, against the free trade agreement that we intend to have with Ecuador, I think, in my view, that's a bit problematic. Canadian, when Canadian investments or any investment go to a country like Ecuador, though it's a middle-income country, it is not a poor country like many countries in Asia and Africa. Still, the investments that go in, Canada being the largest investor there, foreign investor, it creates economic development opportunity. It creates jobs for Ecuadorian people. It creates infrastructure. It can be roads, power generation plants, hospitals, schools. So those are the kind of things, the multiplier effect, the positive multiplier effects of the investment that goes in there should also be considered. And talking of considerations, you did mention that the economist did measure the benefits that this agreement can bring into Canada, which apparently is a bit modest. Did that economist calculate the lost opportunity cost, economic opportunity cost, by not having a trade agreement, free trade agreement, wherein our competitors, take the example of supplying lentils or wheat, our competitors having a free trade agreement causing potential loss to Canadian trade with Ecuador?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that is an important element of an economic model, is to consider the opportunity costs. I'm just not sure if ours does that. I'm not saying it does or doesn't. I don't know. I would have to check with our chief economist's office to answer your question more fully, and I'm happy to do that.
My only suggestion or comment, I'm sure as very experienced negotiators, trade negotiators, who have successfully conducted very beneficial trade agreements across the countries in the world with Canada. My only thing is that let's be pragmatic when we have a free trade agreement. The environmental chapter is important because that is one of our objective. But as we know that we are just one side of the table, one partner in the two people at the table. We are only one of us. So let's also give due consideration to the interest of Canada, Canadian economic interest, Canadian trade interest. At the end of the day, our prosperity that we enjoy today is only due to the international trade, which contributes to about 67% of our GDP. So let's not forget that big picture in mind when we have agreements, negotiations with small markets or big markets, etc. With my limited time, I just want to ask questions. It was touched upon by my colleague. With free trade agreement with Ecuador, will it create a base for Canadian companies to explore further into the region where we don't have free trade agreement? Can Ecuador act as a base to open doors, or to channel our exports, our trade to other countries in the region?
Thank you for the question. I think it absolutely can. It's one of the areas that certainly we see through our experience, and when we see what happens with an FTA after X number of years being in place, is that you establish your linkages with companies, whether it's enhanced supply chains or whether it's finished products. And then depending on the country and how they're set up, and it strikes me that in this case, Ecuador is well placed within the context of South America to do that, just as you outlined. But we'll have to see, frankly. I'm not, that also depends kind of on their economy, how they're set up, what their companies are doing, and the transportation network, et cetera. But it certainly strikes me that is certainly quite possible.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci. On sait qu'il y a eu des scandales entourant les comportements des minières qui souvent vont finalement être militarisés. Il va y avoir des altercations avec les populations autochtones. On en a parlé un petit peu plus tôt. Comment s'assurer qu'il y ait des mesures de...
Translation problem again. Can we try it again? Mr. Savard-Tremblay,
Oui, parfait.
start again?
Est-ce que c'est bon, l'interprétation?
Try it. If you could start again, Mr.
Oui, alors je repose ma question. On sait qu'il y a des scandales en...
Is it working now?
Now it's working. Thank you very much.
La troisième sera la bonne. Alors, on sait qu'il y a
Third time lucky. We know that there scandals about the mines in many countries, not just in Ecuador. There will be militarization. There will be altercations between the local population, especially the native ones. How can we make sure that there will be proper measures of overseeing the Canadian companies? The ambassador of Ecuador will said that it could increase the mining. How are we guaranteed that human rights will be respected in these agreements?
Well, I think excellent question to begin. From our perspective, we think the free trade agreement with robust provisions on labor and the environment, et cetera, will be a net benefit. We're also always looking to understand what complementary initiatives we can undertake, including with respect to our broader responsible business conduct regime in Canada, and also initiatives in the bilateral relationship that would be supportive to the trade agreement. And in that regard, we welcome feedback from this committee on the kinds of things that we should be looking at more holistically in the relationship to support the free trade agreement.
Est-ce qu'on peut attendre quelque chose d'un peu plus robuste, justement, vous parlez de chapitre?
Can we expect something more robust? In the last agreement, we insisted on principles, but there was no mechanism. Can we expect something supplementary this time?
Well, what we are doing right now is we're doing the policy work on the various chapters that we are considering for proposal, including a built-up, dedicated, responsible business conduct chapter. We would welcome feedback from you and the committee on the kinds of things that would be of interest in that regard. I'll also say that we're looking at, again, complementary initiatives to support our broader objectives in the relationship.
Et nous en prenons bonne note.
Thank you very much.
We take notice of it.
Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to follow up with, I guess, a kind of similar question. And that is, we've heard that Ecuador's biggest trading partner, most of that is in mining. And we have, I think, admirable chapters on the rights of indigenous peoples, on the environment, et cetera. And apparently there are dispute mechanisms that would go along with those chapters that Canada could complain if Ecuador is not abiding by them. I'm just wondering, because we have a situation here where it seems most of the human rights violations, most of the environmental problems that the Ecuadorians are concerned about are being caused by Canadian mining companies that are being protected by an ISDS provision. Who makes those complaints and how are they adjudicated? Because it just seems that we're working at cross purposes here. And just so I can get it in before my time's up, would one of these things that might go along with it be a stronger ombudsperson for responsible enterprise in Canada that has the powers to get documents, get witnesses to testify, because that's what she said to this committee she needed to make the changes necessary.
Well, on that, I will just note that the question pertains to a much broader global responsible business conduct regime in Canada. At present, Canada has measures and frameworks in place to encourage responsible business conduct by Canadian companies active abroad. The government has 2 non-judicial dispute settlement mechanisms: our National Contact Point for Responsible Business Conduct and the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. Also notable, Canada's Corruption of Foreign Officials Act, which continues to help ensuring that Canadian businesses are engaging responsibly in their engagement with foreign public officials. As regards the particular FTA, we're working on a chapter, would welcome feedback on the kinds of things that would go on that chapter. But I'll also say that we have a number of other initiatives underway outside of the FTA that are of note. Just next week, a project will begin where a Canadian international development company will be providing advice and assistance to the Ecuadorian government in the development of a free, prior, and informed consent law. I think that's a very net positive opportunity for Canada to make a positive contribution to these issues in Ecuador, and one that I think complements the free trade agreement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Excusez-moi. Ma question est pour Monsieur.
My question is to Mr. Bouchard. Mr. Bouchard,
En date de l'année 2022, le blé
in
pictatif
2022,
76% des exportations du Canada en Équateur.
76% of those exports to Ecuador. Is it possible to hear about the contribution to get more Canadian jobs? Thank you for the question, but just to clarify, as to we deal with the rights of workers, so we don't deal with anything else in this chapter. Thank you for the question.
You'd like to understand how many jobs were created based on the amount of exports? Did I catch that correctly? Est-ce que j'ai bien compris la question comme ça?
C'est que c'est surtout en date de 2022.
In 2022, 76% of the exports, it came mostly from Alberta and Saskatchewan. Is it to know how more Canadian jobs would be created in those two sectors?
Thank you for the question and the clarification. I appreciate that. So our economic model, to the best of my knowledge, does not necessarily equate jobs created with the amount of new exports, I think. So opportunities to access new markets will certainly create more production and more exports. I think especially our agriculture system on the prairies is certainly based around exports. And so if we have new markets for our wheat, for our lentils, for our oats, certainly there will be more farming jobs, more jobs on the farm, more jobs in the processing, and more jobs in transportation. So again, I'm not aware of the economic modeling around the number of jobs, but I think just intuitively we have seen that from a policy perspective.
Voyez-vous que la même ordre d'idée, parce qu'on considère que l'Alberta,
we feel that Alberta and Saskatchewan represent 3/4 of Canada's exports. Do we believe that other provinces could contribute more, could top, if I may say so, this?
Thank you for the question. Again, I don't know about topping, but certainly I think we have an opportunity to increase our exports. Again, just to go over what I said, so certainly the dutiable export, or where we stand to benefit the most, is where we pay the most duty, and that's certainly on goods like wheat and like lentils. As my colleague mentioned earlier, it's not the only place that we will benefit, and certainly, and again, as you noted, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, with respect to oats, do produce a lot of those products. However, some of the industrial products that will benefit from FTAs include machinery parts, helicopters, plastics, and iron and steel. So those are produced in various provinces, and I'm not sure exactly which ones would benefit the most, but certainly beyond Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba is where we see a lot of that industrial production. So.
Est-ce que le LNG, le gaz naturel, pourrait être
What about natural gas? Would natural gas be a potential sector that could later be exploited? LNG?
Je ne suis pas au
Well, that's a
courant.
good question. I'm not aware of all the measures in place for LNG and for exports of that product. Nevertheless, we need to have a certain capacity for, well, to change LNG to process it in order to transport it. There's no pipeline between Canada and Ecuador, so we would need to transport it on board a ship or something like that.
A plant in place that would be able to transform that liquid natural gas into a transportable subject. Maybe working on it. I'm just not aware of it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sheehan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. The Trade Commissioner Services had identified some opportunities that match, with Canadian capabilities and local demand. And you've touched on quite a few of them. The extractive industry, you've covered agriculture as well. But some of the other ones that they had identified, for instance, and I'm interested in this, Sault Ste. Marie is the self-declared alternative energy capital of North America. We don't say alternative energy, we say like clean tech and clean technology or green technology. They have identified clean technology as opportunities. What kind of opportunities in clean technology would they be talking about?
Well, I think what I would say is that Ecuador currently maintains an average tariff rate of 17% on non-agricultural goods. They have broad tariff coverage inside their profile. When you think about a long-term trade relationship, this FTA will provide for basically competitive opportunities in any sector. We don't have a particular clean tech stakeholder group that has stepped forward, but I would say that over a long time horizon, you can imagine this as being a facilitative agreement in any services or goods trade commercial sector.
And it just seems to me that a lot of countries are interested in our technology around, say, small nuclear reactors and things of that nature, where they could be deployed in areas that are, hard to get at, if you will, whether it's up north in Canada or Japan. There's a real interest in that. Will there be opportunities for that particular industry too to sort of participate in the analysis of the opportunities?
Well, reactors haven't come up as a particular interest, but I would come back to my previous comments and indicate that where demand arises in the commercial relationship, this free trade agreement would support and facilitate expanded trade on a competitive basis.
Services also just talks about infrastructure opportunities. Could you describe what that looks like? What are the opportunities and what are the benefits to Canada and, for that matter, to the country we're trading with, Ecuador?
Sure. Well, to put it in terms of the architecture of the agreement, the trade in goods provisions, the elimination of customs duties on all non-agricultural products is what we're going to be looking for. So that would facilitate the trade in goods. The services and temporary entry for business persons provisions that we will seek would provide for the liberalization and market access commitments on non-discrimination in those areas and facilitate the ability for high-skilled professionals to move more easily between the two. So there's a bit of a value chain aspect to putting together the various provisions of the agreement. But broad sectoral benefits is what we would anticipate within the scale of the relationship.
And if I could just add to that as well, speaking about infrastructure and government procurement, right, is the other piece of that. And I think that's another important chapter for us, broad-based, but certainly within this FTA as well, and to make sure that there are meaningful market access commitments on both reciprocal opportunities on both parties' sides here. So,
and as well, we were talking about the opportunities to improve environmental cooperation. I was thinking of the agreement that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Canadian, had signed with the Ecuadorian government recently, and it's in particular to eradicate the dark vessels that are around the Galapagos Islands. Could you make comments on that and what kind of cooperation that helps foster in your negotiations?
Well, I would describe that agreement as one of the many potential supporting agreements or mechanisms that we have outside of the free trade agreement negotiation itself that would be mutually supportive with the environment chapter that we would plan to negotiate and the cooperation activities that we would undertake under that environment chapter. Like with any trading partner, where we have a free trade agreement, we usually have many, many other bilateral agreements of various natures. And so the dark vessels agreement would be one of those mutually supportive types of treaties alongside a free trade agreement if we were to conclude negotiations and implement.
And I think that, that is extremely important because we have a new president in Ecuador that, again, seems to be progressive in my interpretation and very, very hopeful that we can continue to work together and improve on this planet because the overfishing, especially in the Galapagos Islands and other very sensitive marine areas, really, really can set forth a domino effect of terrible things. So I just wanted to point that out because there are some good indicators of some advancement, if you will, in particular. And I pointed out to the agreements that were signed in May of 2023 around gender. And just there was another one, too, around trade in general about an agreement of trying to improve everyone's lives. Could you make a comment about that one? The name is escaping me right now. I think it's called... Sorry, it escaped me. It was...
The Inclusive Trade Action Group, possibly.
That's
yeah. Well, indeed, again, another example of mutually supporting agreements, that in that case, a plurilateral type of initiative, cooperative in nature, but not in any way in conflict with a bilateral free trade agreement, complementary to it. And with regards to the dark vessel agreement, we will pass on your interest to our environment negotiators on the matter of ocean environmental issues. They're watching right now.
Much. So to committee rounds, we have completed 3 rounds. We have a few minutes. Does anyone have a pressing question of our departmental officials? Okay, so does anyone have a pressing question a short one that won't take too long? Mr. Cannings?
Yeah, I would just like to ask someone to expand on this issue of ISDS being unconstitutional in Ecuador, where that stands.
So we've had discussions just in terms of what that what the court has said and so on and so forth, but I'm really not in a position to comment on the Constitution of Ecuador. I'm certainly not an expert in that, but if Ecuador has considerations to share in that regard, we'll look to discuss that at the negotiating table for sure.
Mr. Tremblay?
Je voudrais savoir, on a reçu Amnesty
I would like to know, we received Amnesty International 2 days ago here, and they invited us not to approve an agreement that is carried out without the participation of indigenous populations, especially indigenous women and their organizations, which are quite active. Is there some way in which a process or some process that we could use to ensure this transparency and consultation of indigenous populations down there in Ecuador? In other words, are there any conditions for Ecuador in that regard?
Well, I can only comment on what we have in Canada. We do have an Indigenous working group that we consult with throughout our FTA process, and we will continue to do that. Again, j'ai bien compris la question concernant l'Ecuador.
Oui, c'est ça.
I think I understood the question about Ecuador. In negotiations, there's concerns for human rights and there are conditions that can be imposed. For example, they may say, if you want us to negotiate or sign, then you have to guarantee that it's being done correctly and transparently on your side.
Well, in We will be engaging with our Ecuadorian colleagues to compare notes on our respective domestic approaches. I guess I would just add that we also have supporting programming right now to make a positive impact on the development of the free, prior, and informed consent laws of Ecuador, with a team going down next week, which I'm very heartened by in terms of a supportive initiative.
J'en suis fort heureux dans ce cas.
I'm very glad to hear it then.
A quick question on the investment side. In my previous life, when I was still a student, I think in my economic class, I learned trade follows investment. I don't know if it is still true. We don't have a current foreign investment protection agreement as of now. And the protection that is available to Canadian investments will expire in 2033, if I'm not wrong. So if we don't have a free trade agreement with a dedicated investment chapter and provisions like ISDS, etc., the current investments and any potential investments for Canadian companies going in there, they will have to go in, the new investments have to go in without any sort of protection. So that will create hesitation amongst the Canadian companies to expand into Ecuador. Can you highlight the need for this free trade agreement, in addition to exporting our goods like wheat, etc., why it is required to have a door open for the safe investment of Canadian businesses?
Certainly. So thank you for the question. So first of all, again, to clarify in terms of what the current status is, you're absolutely right that going forward, because the Foreign Investment Protection Agreement we had with Ecuador has been terminated, only investments that were made in and around 2018 are protected until 2033. So anything after that would not be protected by that agreement. And because we don't yet have an agreement where we haven't started negotiations with Ecuador on a free trade agreement with an investment chapter with investor state, there can be no protection for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. As you can see, the bells have started. We have got a vote call. Thank you very much for all our witnesses. That was very valuable information. We appreciated your patience and all the rest of it. So thank you all very much. Move adjournment.